Okay, guys, so this is our first of a couple of at-home notes that you're going to be taking during our evolution unit. You should be using the note sheet that I gave you in class. Know that that note sheet is a little different looking for these set of notes, so if you need to pause, rewind, definitely feel free. Also, if you have questions, jot them down and we can talk about them during the next class period. So we're going to be talking a lot about Charles Darwin, who kind of gets all of the credit for what we understand about the theory of evolution and how it relates to biology. But Darwin had a lot of influencers, so people and scientific ideas that helped him create this theory and compile his evidence in a way that has allowed us to know this theory of evolution to be true. So the first influence that we want to talk about is something called stratigraphy, which is just the study of the Earth's layer or strata. Strata is just another word for layer. Basically, here's a nice little picture to kind of show us, but we know that things change over time. And when we look at the layers of the Earth, really, I'm specifically talking about the layers of the crust, which is the layer of the Earth that we live on, we can see different things in those different layers, right? So if you look here, we see these fossils. We can see that those lived at a particular time before fossils that may have occurred up higher in the strata. So as you go down in these strata, we see that things are older, and we can use these as a timeline of sorts. Uniformitarianism was an idea put forward by Hutton and Lyell, who were geologists. And basically down here is kind of our main idea of this. The idea that geological mechanisms, things that are happening geologically now, have always happened in that way. When I say mechanisms, I'm talking about, again, we know that we live on Earth's crust, which is the upper, very thin, solid layer of the Earth. And the crust is actually floating on the mantle, which is a semi-liquid melted rock. So the crust is not sitting still, it's moving. And this is causing things like earthquakes and volcanoes because of the movement and interaction between those tectonic plates. Maybe you've heard that word before. We have to understand, and Hutton and Lyell, as well as Darwin and other scientists did understand, that this is something that has happened consistently over time. Just because we didn't realize it was happening way back when doesn't mean that it wasn't, because of the observations that we can make today regarding these mechanisms. So on your sheet, you're going to fill in that box in the upper right-hand corner that asks this question: how, oops, I'm moving this. How did this influence Darwin and his study? Darwin could compare fossils of the past to organisms now. So both when looking at the strata of the Earth and also when looking at these mechanisms, things like how tectonic plates moved and the fossils that may exist in those plates. We know these things to be true because of this idea of uniformitarianism. Here's just another example of stratigraphy, right? So if you're looking at these layers of rock, the younger rocks are up at the top and our older rocks are down lower. This led scientists of the time, of Darwin's time, to start to think that, maybe the Earth is a little bit older than we thought it was. And at the time that Darwin and others were doing their research, the common idea was that the Earth was a couple thousand years old. And we now, in fact, know that this isn't true, and this is what Darwin and others were really criticized for saying, is that the Earth is millions or potentially even billions of years old. So a couple of important scientists. The first one is Thomas Malthus, and he wrote this essay on the principle of population. And he was really looking at human populations during a time when the Industrial Revolution was happening in Europe, and people were living in spaces where they could not live comfortably. And what he figured out is that population is eventually limited by famine and disease. And scientists took this idea and said, well, if this is true for humans, why wouldn't this be true for animals? If you have a space with limited resources, it makes sense that a population can't grow and grow and grow and grow. At some point, some animal isn't going to get the food that it needs, or a disease is going to come in and wipe out a whole bunch of those animals because of the close quarters that they're living in. So Darwin and others used these ideas of population, principles of population, to figure out, or to kind of delve more deeply into ideas of evolution. And we're going to come back to this when we talk about competition as it relates to evolution. Okay, our next scientist, who was actually known as a naturalist back in the day, but really he was a biologist, is Count George Louis Leclerc de Buffon. It's a big, long name. You'll often just hear me call him Buffon or Leclerc de Buffon. His main idea, and he did research for years and years and years, but his main idea, and it seems like a common observation, but it actually wasn't at the time, is what's bolded here: species today were not in the same form as when they were created. In other words, things have changed over time, and he observed this through looking at fossils, looking at strata in certain landforms. And this was kind of a big deal in a way of thinking at the time. And he was actually the mentor of a man named Lamarck, who we're going to look at on the next page. So main idea in that box for Buffon, you should probably just write that bolded section there. Okay, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is super important. He proposed the mechanism of use and disuse and inheritance of acquired traits to explain how species might change over time. Okay, and again, if you write nothing else on that in that box for him, it's this idea of use and disuse. And again, he studied with Le Correcte Buffon. So we're going to talk a little bit about what use and disuse means in a moment. But then we have Charles Darwin, okay, who was influenced by everything that we just talked about and more. And he developed his idea of natural selection and the origin of the species, okay? So evolution through natural selection. He saw some patterns while he was on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He was looking specifically at patterns of diversity, so how different living things that were technically the same species look different. He was looking at living organisms and fossils. And as you may know, he specifically was traveling. He traveled all over the world, but he did a ton of his research in the Galapagos Islands, which are kind of like right over here, okay? Specifically, he was looking at Galapagos finches. And a finch is kind of like a little bird. And there's a ton of variety in finches. There are multiple species of finches, and they look weirdly really different. The Galapagos are unique because they're small islands that are close together, but they're far enough apart where if a bird ends up on one island, it's not an easy task to then fly to another island. So what happened was we had what Darwin believed was there was this one species of finch at the beginning, and as they spread out to different islands over time with slightly different environments, we ended up with finches that looked totally different depending on where they had to shelter and what it is that they had to eat. So we had two main scientists who had totally different ideas about how exactly these changes occur. So Lamarck was a French naturalist. He correctly observed that living things change over time, but his main idea down here was evolution by acquired characteristics. Acquired means like you get it. And he thought, and I'll show you a little picture on the next page, he thought that organisms during their lifetime could acquire new traits as necessary. Darwin was an English naturalist. His main kind of claim to fame was his research that he did while on the HMS Beagle, specifically in the Galapagos, and his idea was evolution by natural selection. So notice they're both talking about evolution, but the mechanism for evolution, according to the two, is different. So quickly, we're going to talk about acquired characteristics, okay? So Lamarck believed, and this kind of tries to show us this, is that if you had an animal, we're going to use a giraffe as an example, and the giraffe was able to eat leaves, foliage that was at eye level, right? It would have no problem living just the way it is, eating the leaves here. But he believed through his research that, let's say a giraffe lived in an environment that suddenly all of the trees were tall, and the only way that it was going to be able to get those leaves from the top of the tree was if its neck was longer. So according to evolution by acquired characteristics, that giraffe over time could stretch its neck to then acquire this trait of having a long neck that allowed it to eat those leaves that were up high. So again, this is the idea of evolution by acquired characteristics, okay? So here it is. By using a trait, an organism can change the trait and pass it on to their offspring. So again, this would be like if I were to have an accident and lose my hand, which means I would only have one hand, right? And that would be my new acquired trait, that if I were to have a child, my child would also be born without a hand. And hopefully you're thinking, that does not make sense. That's wrong. And that was what Darwin argued. He said, this doesn't make sense. If you observe acquired traits, whether on purpose or by accident, of any organism, their offspring doesn't necessarily have that same trait. So Lamarck eventually was proven wrong. And over time, and we'll talk more about this over the next couple of weeks, Darwin and his idea of evolution by natural selection prevailed. So some clarifications to end these notes. According to natural selection, populations change and evolve, not individuals. So a population of giraffes over time and over generations could in fact acquire a longer neck, but that has to do with what we call the survival of the fittest. Those who are most fit to survive will survive to produce offspring. Only genetic or inherited traits may be passed on to future generations, right? So if it's a trait that's acquired that's not genetic, it's not going to get passed on. And number 3 is that population change is caused by change in an environment. So if we look at that giraffe example one more time, the reason that a giraffe population over time could acquire longer necks would be because maybe they suddenly live in an environment where there are taller trees. But again, individuals do not evolve, organisms do. Okay, so that's just about it. Again, feel free to rewind, rewatch, see if you can get all of that worksheet filled in, and we will talk more about Charles Darwin next class.